Chris. And you let me know, are we ready?
Right.
All right, we are live streaming. So welcome to those who are here. For anyone who does not know me, my name is James Reichschneider. I'm captain of the police department here in Palo Alto. My primary duties are in the investigations bureau, but I'm also responsible for a number of other things to include our military equipment policy and such. The purpose of, next slide. The purpose of the meeting today is to do a couple of things. One is to provide an overview of the specialized equipment that our department has and to the extent that we use it, so that there's a familiarity in the community with what's out there and whether and if it's being used and under what circumstances, and to a certain extent, why we have the equipment that we use. And also to allow for anyone present to ask questions if they have them or express concerns. We've also allowed the opportunity for those that were not able to be here in person to submit questions in advance of the meeting if they'd like to have those questions. The other purpose of the meeting, which I should add, and we'll get to the background of Assembly Bill 481, is that AB 481 actually has a statutory requirement that on an annual basis that departments host a meeting such as this one. So in addition to providing information for the information's sake, we're also doing this in compliance with the statute. Next slide, please. Okay, there you go. So by way of background for anyone that's not already familiar, or as a refresher, back in September of 2021, California Governor Newsom signed a series of police reform measures, one of which was Assembly Bill 481, which I'll refer to as AB 481 hereinafter. AB 481 is intended to do a couple of things, which is regulate the acquisition and use of certain types of specialized equipment by local law enforcement agencies, and also to provide an additional layer of transparency to community members about what equipment is being used by their department. Approximately a year later, in compliance with AB 481, the Palo Alto City Council in September of 2022 enacted City Ordinance 5562, which incorporates the Palo Alto Police Department Policy 716 on military equipment. So that's a fancy,
I'm sorry.
716.
Thank you.
So that's a long-winded way of saying that in September of 2022, the police department presented to the city council a report on equipment we already possess and under what circumstances we used said equipment. And we obtained the city council's blessing to continue to use the equipment we'd already been using for the forthcoming year. What brings us back here today is the next statutory requirement under 41, which is for us to come back to our governing body once annually to report on the use of any of the equipment we have, any additional expenditures that occurred during the year or are anticipated in the coming year, to report on any citizen complaints we received about the use of any of this equipment, and also to report on any policy violations that we may have uncovered involving the use of the equipment during the year. That meeting, or this meeting tonight, is the first step in that process. Thereafter, on November 13th, this item will come before the city council for consideration. At that time, staff will be recommending that the city council essentially reenact the existing ordinance, as we are not asking for the acquisition of any additional types of equipment this year. So as an overview of AB 481, AB 481, next slide, please. AB 481 regulates 15 different types of specialized equipment. And those types of equipment regulate anything from unmanned aerial vehicles, drones, armored cars, all that kind of stuff, all the way up to high caliber firearms and the like. I'm only going to talk today about the 5 categories or 5 types of regulated equipment that Palo Alto Police Department possesses. So we do have a command and control vehicle, which is one type of equipment that's regulated by 481. Ours is known as the Mobile Emergency Operations Center, or MEOC. If you can picture it in your head, it's essentially a really big RV that has a lot of AV equipment in it. So it's capable of acting as an emergency dispatch center if our 911 dispatch center goes offline. It's also capable of acting as essentially a mobile command post or a meeting center out in the field if we have a critical incident where we need to bring in a lot of assets and it's not practical to meet back at the station and then act out in the field. So that's one piece of equipment, and that is actually maintained and run by our Office of Emergency Services. Although the police department has access to it, the Office of Emergency Services is actually the owner and operator of the MEOC. The next item or next category is less lethal munitions. Specifically, we have what are called SAGE guns or SAGE devices. They're essentially a handheld device that fires a rubber projectile. We're actually looking into transitioning to a foam projectile and going away from the rubber, because the thinking being that foam has even less potential for injury to the person. But we want to explore that thoroughly before we make that decision. But in any case, we do possess less lethal munitions in the form of rubber projectiles. Those are used in a situation where manual force may not be adequate. Maybe a person is armed with something other than a firearm, like a knife, a bat, something of that ilk. And they can be used to engage somebody in a non-lethal way from distance. So that way we can hopefully induce compliance without having officers have to go hands-on or use a firearm or other form of lethal force. The third category or type that we possess is chemical agents. We have a very limited inventory of chemical agents. We have chemical agents in the form of pepperball guns, which, if you can picture in your mind a paintball gun, it's essentially the same device. The balls themselves look a lot like a paintball. The only thing is, instead of having marking paint inside, they have essentially, think of pepper spray reduced into a powder. So if you're familiar with pepper spray, basically makes your eyes water, makes your nose run. It can be used effectively as a way to distract somebody if you need to take them into custody without having to use lethal force, and hopefully without having to have multiple officers physically engage somebody, maybe hit them with a baton, etc. So it's an option available to officers for circumstances like that. The other type of chemical agent we have is we do have gas canisters that can be used in ferret rounds that can be used for barricaded suspect or barricaded subject type situations. Those are essentially designed to be either, in the case of a ferret round, fired from something that looks a lot like a paint gun or a paintball gun, also from distance, and it delivers a concentrated burst of that same irritant powder inside of an enclosed space. We also do have more traditional gas canisters that are specifically assigned and only used by our SWAT team. So those are used and deployed only by our specially trained folks who are qualified annually on how to use it and instructed by a SWAT team member who is specifically trained on how to deliver the training on when to use it. Those are not carried or deployed by patrol officers, detectives, etc. Diversionary devices, sometimes referred to as flashbangs. Again, those are exclusively in the possession and exclusively used by our SWAT team. So those are devices that are used, they're called diversionary devices because they make a loud noise, they create a burst of light, which can be disorienting and distracting to a dangerous suspect. The idea is that those would be deployed with an armed suspect that you're trying to confuse or disorient when you're moving in for an arrest. The hope being that you've distracted somebody away from using force against our officers and hopefully prevent our officers from needing to use force on them. The second to last category, long range acoustical device. The LRAD, it looks an awful lot like a megaphone. It's basically just a really loud megaphone that has one critical feature. It's directional. So I kind of describe it as, if you can think of a megaphone, it projects wide, but it loses its potency very quickly because it's a wide distribution of the noise. An LRAD can be focused more narrowly. And essentially, we use it for one function and one function alone, which is to hopefully communicate with what we think might be a dangerous subject inside of the structure without having our officers need to go in close or kick a door or come in through a window. So it allows our officers to talk loudly from a distance and direct the message at where they want to talk. I will be more than happy to answer your question. Just let me run through the list first. We do have one of those. And then the last item that we possess that meets any of the 481 categories is we do possess one sniper rifle. Again, that sniper rifle is used exclusively by one member of the department who is specially trained as a member of the SWAT team to be a marksman. That person not only does a substantial amount of training on the front end to become a marksman, but does regular monthly qualifiers to make sure that they maintain their proficiency with the rifle. And they're the only person that would deploy that rifle in a critical incident only when other measures are not appropriate. So that's the entirety of the catalog of items that we possess under 481. I can't speak in detail about what every other department in the area or state has. I will tell you anecdotally that we possess the same or fewer qualifying items than most or all agencies in the Bay Area. There are many agencies in the Bay Area that have quite a bit more than only 5 categories or 5 types of qualifying items. So we don't have anything individually or by way of the volume of the list that puts us out of sync with other comparable agencies in the area. Next slide, please. So we talked a little bit about this, but AB 481 requires that we do several things. One of which was receive City Council initial approval for the continued use of qualifying equipment already possessed. So in other words, back in 2021, we already possessed all of the items that I just mentioned. We had already been using them in most cases or all. We've probably been using those items for a decade or longer, in some cases much longer than a decade. But 481 required us to go before our city council, disclose those items, and essentially ask for permission to continue using those items. We did receive that approval. It also requires us to publish an annual report, which is here and also available online for review. It documents in that report any qualifying equipment we've used over the course of the last year, any complaints we've received from the public regarding the use of any of this equipment, any policy violations we've uncovered or discovered over the last year involving the use of this equipment, and any expenditures the department has made during that time related to this type of equipment, or expenditures that are anticipated in the coming 12 months related to this type of equipment. We publish that, and we are next now doing the next item on the list, which is hosting a community meeting to discuss sort of an update of where we are. And the last item, as yet unchecked, is to receive city council approval for the continued use or new purchases. And as I think I mentioned earlier, that's currently scheduled for the council meeting on November 13th of this year. Next slide. So here's a basic overview of what is contained in our annual report. We only had one type of equipment that was used in an operational setting over the last 12 months, and it was only used once, and that was the MEOP, the Mobile Operations Center, which was deployed in support of President Biden's visit to Palo Alto back in June of this year. It was used as a way to provide dispatching support to the units who were in the area, to include Secret Service and some other entities. All the other equipment that we possess was used over the last 12 months, but it was used only in the context of testing the equipment, practicing with the equipment, training with the equipment, having officers be certified to continue to use the equipment. So it's critically important to understand that this type of equipment, because it's the kind of thing that's only used rarely and in critical incidents, it's important that we continue to have familiarity with the equipment. So that's why we do training on a regular basis. And so that's why you see expenditures for replacement items. It's so that we can have our officers continue to have that, renew that perishable skill and be familiar with this type of equipment, because even though it's rare, if this equipment has to be used in a real world event, it's really important that that officer know how to use it safely and properly the one time that they may be required to use it. Complaints. We did not receive any citizen complaints regarding the use of this equipment over the last 12 months. As you might anticipate, given that there was only one operational deployment, that being the MEOC, we did not identify any policy violations regarding the use of this equipment over the last 12 months. The only expenditure associated with any of this equipment over the last 12 months had to do with the upkeep, updating, and repair of the MEOC, and that cost approximately $13,000 over the last year. For those curious about such things, the MEOC's maintenance and upkeep has a line item in the general fund budget for the police department and the Office of Emergency Services. So this was not an unplanned expense we had to go looking for money for. There is an annual amount of money. I believe it's not to exceed 25,000, and only 13 was used in the most recent 12 months. So none of the other equipment needed to be purchased or replenished over the last 12 months, but as I'll talk about in a minute, we do have some planned replenishment that will happen over the next 12 months. Next slide. So planned expenditures. So the MEOC at this point does not have any pre-identified needs for repairs or maintenance over the next 12 months. But as I mentioned, the general fund includes a line item which permits up to $25,000 of repair and maintenance to occur during any given fiscal year. Ammunition replacement, that refers essentially to sniper ammunition. Because of the fact that our marksman has to requalify on a monthly basis, ammunition is unfortunately expensive, and we have to use it on a monthly basis to make sure that that marksman is dialed in and ready to go for the unlikely event that he has to use that rifle. I don't necessarily anticipate that it will cost $2,500 to replenish the ammunition, but that's the ceiling. Chemical agents. So just as a refresher, that refers to our pepper balls, our gas canisters, and our ferret rounds. So in other words, gas or irritants that we employ. Again, we didn't use any of that stuff in an operational setting, but we used it in a training setting. And so we just need to make sure that we have adequate inventory on hand to do two things. One, maintain our training over the next 12 months, and also have it on hand to use operationally if we needed to during that time. And that's estimated to cost approximately $2,300 across all the categories. One thing of note there is that one of those pieces of equipment, and I'll be precise here, the majority of that money is being used to replenish existing equipment with the same thing. So in other words, we're just ordering more canisters of the same thing we already have. However, we are replacing both types of our gas canisters with a different brand of gas canister that has a better, more robust baffling around it. So in other words, it's essentially intended to make sure that we're mitigating any risk of heat, fire, et cetera, when the canister is deployed. The canisters we have now had the best baffling that was available at the time we purchased them. This is now a better, more safer round, and by coincidence, it's a little cheaper. So we'd like to transition over to those type this year. And then lastly, diversionary devices, I referred to them earlier as flashbangs. Same thing, we're simply replacing what we've used via training. It's also worth noting that any of these things on here, or all of these things on here, may be safe for firearm ammunition, have expiration dates where the chemicals inside become non-effective or ineffective. And so in some cases, we do have to replenish things simply because they weren't used during their usable life, and we have to replace for that reason. The same way you may have to buy a new gallon of milk when you haven't yet consumed all the milk in your fridge because it's expired. So I already alluded to this earlier, but I'll say it again. We are not requesting to purchase or acquire any new types of equipment sought. We're simply replacing a couple of our existing chemical agents with safer, less expensive models. Next slide, please. So what is the next step, or what are the next steps? Again, just as a refresher, on the 13th of November, the city council will be asked to do two things. They'll be asked to review the annual report and essentially accept the findings in the report. And they will also be asked to, or we will be recommending that they reenact the existing ordinance 5562. 5562 will be intact with one small exception. The ordinance as written incorporates our policy, which refers to each individual piece of equipment by model number. So because we will be transitioning over to new model numbers on a couple of things, we have to change the policy, which means the ordinance would be slightly different. But in terms of what the ordinance allows us to use and under what circumstances it can be used, no change. Next slide. So before I get to questions or concerns from anyone here, I just want to point out where more information can be found for those in the room, but also those who may be watching this at home or watching it recorded on a later date. If you do visit the police department's dedicated AB 481 webpage, we have a great deal of information there. You can find the staff report from last year. You can find the ordinance itself. You can find our policy. You can find some questions and answers about our policy and about what AB 41 is if you're unclear. And you can also find a copy of the annual report for 2023, which has been published there. And once it's available, you'll be able to find a recording of this meeting to review later at your convenience. For those who may prefer to hear it out loud, that website can be found at www.cityofpaloalto.org/PAPD equipment. So with that, I've completed my prepared remarks about it. I will open it up to questions or concerns from the audience, and I'll do my best to answer any questions. I know you had one, Mr. James, from earlier. Go ahead, or anyone.
I was just going to say that before you started, was my concern that I just happened upon the website, and that a large part of AB 481, of course, is transparency to the community. I think that both the Daily Post, which I read, I will say was regularly, and the weekly would have been interested to have cover this. Because what we have 3 or 4 people here. So I would just ask as a suggestion next year, you try to do more in that regard to get more of the public out. And then I commented that I was at the city council meeting last September when the city council item number 15 was on the calendar, and per my notes from that meeting, it didn't start until 9:45 at night. It was slated to go till 10:30, and that was at least, I put in my notes, correct, you can check the meeting yourself, but 5 hours after the start of the meeting. And so I've encouraged you and Chief Bender to huddle with the city manager to put this at a time where more public input could be had, okay? Because I've found over the years, being somebody that watches these kind of issues relatively closely, that often police practices issues get put on at 8 or 9 or 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night as an afterthought. And I think the spirit of this AB 40 is it shouldn't be an afterthought, okay? I'm gonna pass it to somebody else, but I've got some other questions rather than just concerns when other people have a chance to ask questions.
Understood. Ma'am, did you have any questions or comments? No? Okay, thank you. Questions, comments, Bill? None?
So in reference to moving from with the stage, correct me if I'm wrong,
Yes.
from rubber to foam, I think in San Jose during the response to the George Floyd case, there was use of rubber bullets, and it resulted in a serious injury to at least one person, and it cost the city of San Jose a good amount of money. Okay. So you said you're gonna look at that, and what does that mean? When are you gonna consider moving to foam, and is foam actually less lethal, less injurious? Is there some measurable data on that?
So those are all the same questions that we're asking now. So before we transition to any new piece of equipment or any new kind of, I'll call it ammunition or a round, we want to be thorough in our vetting of it to make sure that we are getting a better product and not something that's just, different but not better. We have to consider a couple different things. One of which is, as I said, and you alluded to, the main reason that we would consider and are considering going to a foam round is the hope that the foam round, and it's being marketed as such, that the foam round has the potential to cause less injury, but still be effective as a distraction device. I do want to vet that though, and also there's a point at which it can become less injurious but no longer effective. So that's why we want to vet that. So we could probably find something that would shoot, for instance, marshmallows, right? And they wouldn't ever injure anyone, but at the same time would be completely ineffective, and so it would be no use for us to own it. So we tasked our range team with doing some testing with the foam rounds to make sure that they are still effective from the same distance or range as the rubber or comparable, to make sure they're just as accurate. Because that's the other thing, is when you change the composition of what you're firing, it has the potential to be less accurate. And we want to make sure anytime we're firing a round, whether it's rubber, foam, or lead, that we're putting our officers in the best position possible to be accurate and only hit the person they're intending to hit. So that's the kind of analysis we're going through right now.
So now, when I looked at Gennadi's piece from last year, he did 2 parts. I was first called Gennadi Shinir, the reporter for the weekly, taking aim, state-built targets, local law enforcement, and military arsenals. And I've heard about this before, is that the acoustical device that you mentioned,
Right.
Maybe it's a different one that I'm referring to, can actually put up so loud that it can be used in quote unquote protest actions where people are protesting under protected protests through the First Amendment, and it'd be so loud it would knock you to your feet. Is that true? Tell me a little bit about that. And because you said you only use it in this one.
So, yeah, the short answer to your question is it has a variable volume. So it can be used in a variety of different settings and different topography. It's helpful to understand where the LRAD actually came from. So the LRAD actually came from search and rescue. It was initially devised to be used from helicopters or vehicles to deliver either evacuation orders or try to communicate with people or deliver messages from a distance. And so that's where it originally came from. Then when people recognized in law enforcement that the clarity of the audio from it was not only far superior to what we were getting out of a traditional megaphone, but that it also had that directional capability. That's why we circled, and a lot of other agencies circled in on it for use in crisis negotiations or hostage negotiations. Because what we found from experience was trying to have a meaningful conversation or a negotiation with somebody via a megaphone or one of the loudspeakers that's installed on a patrol vehicle sounds a lot like talking to somebody through the fast food order window, and is not very effective. And so when we sought grant funding back then to purchase this, and it's stored by and used to this point exclusively by our crisis negotiation team. Could it be used to deliver a dispersal order if that was deemed appropriate under the circumstances? Sure. Does it have the capability of being loud enough that if someone's at an unsafe distance from the business end of the LRAD, would it be uncomfortable, the same as if you were at a concert and too close to a speaker? Yes, those things are plausible. But I think that's why it's important that we regularly do train with this piece of equipment, and that we have a dedicated team of our crisis negotiation team who are responsible for maintaining that equipment, deploying that equipment if needed. When we have deployed it, even outside of a crisis negotiation setting, for example, we're serving an arrest warrant or a search warrant at a residence, and we don't get any response at the front door. Our preference is always to get the attention of those inside and have them come out to us safely before we go in and do our search. That's always the best way to start off. And so this can be used for that purpose. You know, Palo Alto Police Department, we're outside of 1234 Maple Street. The residents need to come out. We have a search warrant. And if we're going to deploy it in that setting, we actually bring along one of our crisis negotiators to deploy it because they're familiar with the equipment.
So does your policy specifically say this isn't to be used in protest actions where people's First Amendment rights might be impacted, or doesn't it go say, oh, sure, I don't know, I'm just that.
I don't have the policy in front of me to know, so I don't want to commit to that. I will say that by practice, it's only ever been used by our crisis negotiation team, and it's kept in their equipment locker for deployment. I will also say that we have pretty strict, I think we have a pretty comprehensive policy when it comes to dealing with protected First Amendment speech and activity, to include protests and the like, demonstrations and the like, that govern essentially a hands-off approach unless there's a serious threat to property or a threat of violence.
So in reference to more transparency, theoretically, what opportunity do you provide, if any, to the city council or members of the community that are interested in actually seeing these weapons and having some sort of demonstration, even if it's a virtual one, so that we understand more of the potential impact rather than just the verbal exchange and the report?
Fair point. I recall last September having a pretty lengthy and robust conversation with a number of the council members who had questions about the equipment we were using to educate them, because, quite honestly, as you imply, the majority of people would never have occasion to use this stuff. And so they need to know what it is. And in a lot of cases, what it's not, right? I will say, though, that one of the purposes, and I don't want to speak on behalf of the legislature, but as I understood it, one of the reasons that AB 41 was so specific about what information you had to include about the equipment. So in other words, it wasn't sufficient to say, we have flashbangs. You had to actually specify what make and model of flashbang you have and what its capabilities are. I think that was the legislature's attempt to provide the public with a good description of what it is in writing and an ample description, so if they wanted to Google it, they could easily find, the manufacturer's video or YouTube video or something to show what it was.
See, I think I've seen, for instance, maybe at Bull Park years ago, the mobile device. Somebody, one of your officers was out there showing it to the public. So again, my thought would be, if we have this arsenal and there's no confidentiality issues or police officer safety issues, then it might be a good idea, just lay them out, show the citizens what they are. If that's not unworkable, I
Sure,
think
something to consider.
that would be a suggestion. Now, the article itself, and I'm not saying that they got it right, but the weekly article that came out December 9th, 2022, this is a lead piece, taking aim, state build targets, local law enforcement, military arsenal, and they had a bar graph here, how much have local law enforcement agencies spent on military equipment? In the Santa Clara County Sheriff's Office, 2.8, and then they talk about the San Mateo County Sheriff, and then in terms of local cities, Palo Alto is at 718,000 and 8,200, and so it's large, it's bigger than Mountain View. Redwood City has 258,755, and they talk about Stanford, East Palo Alto, and Atherton. So that's I'm just saying it's a slight discrepancy from what you said in terms of Palo Alto having less, maybe this is wrong, not true.
So I think the answer to that was, if I remember that chart correctly, is
Yeah.
that chart incorporates, the Mobile Emergency Operations Center, so in other words, the MEOC. And if you were to tally up the total cost of all of the items we have, the MEOC the cost of the MEOC would dwarf the cost of any of the other equipment that's on that list. And the other agencies that are listed here, at least at that time, did not possess one. So I think that's probably the explanation for the difference in dollar figure, is simply if we did not possess that Mobile Emergency Operations Center, we would immediately go below most or all of those other agencies on the list.
That makes sense. So I think this is my final question, maybe not, but if you had to budgetary force you to remove any of your military weapons, what would your first choice be in terms of demilitarizing? And I'm not saying you're gonna do that. I'm just saying, if the city council says, we're not gonna give you this kind of money, we want to see some of the military weapons go. It's a judgment call. Maybe that's, you have to huddle with the chief on that. I wouldn't mind hearing his perspective on that or somebody else, but give me your shot on that.
I 100% couldn't give you an answer today, because just the same way that I wouldn't make a decision about foam versus rubber rounds without having vetted it. I would want to sit down with, our SWAT team leaders. I'd want to sit down with our crisis negotiators. I'd want to talk to the folks from the Office of Emergency Services about, how, are there other values to the MEOC? What expenses are coming up, all those kinds of things. So there's too many variables for me to prioritize which of these things is more important to me. Or to answer your question, there are too many variables for me to identify one thing as being least important to me right now.
Next year, maybe I'll come back and ask the same question, give you a year.
Fair enough.
Okay, I appreciate you being patient with me and taking into my questions here.
And it's worth pointing out too, in response to that. So one thing I don't know that I mentioned expressly, but is on our AB 481 webpage, is there is an online portal, so that if over the course of the year, folks have questions or concerns about our equipment, hey, what is that? Or do you have this? We do have a way to submit that without knowing who you have to send an email to or who you have to call. There's a web portal which will get to my attention and I will be responsive to. So if anyone listening or watching has questions after today's presentation or at any time during the year, that portal is not something that goes away after this process. That will be something that we'll continue to check.
Apologize, one more question.
Of course.
So I think the military has tasers, okay? And I understand that the tasers are not classified under AB 481 as military equipment. Is that correct?
Yes and no. So there's an item called the Taser Shockwave, which is a specific military taser device, which is actually covered by AB 481. It's called the Taser Shockwave.
But what's the purpose?
I can't speak intelligently about it. I believe that it has a larger spread and more probes. And it's not, and it's intended for, my understanding is that it's intended for a combat application. I'm unaware, I could be wrong, certainly. I'm unaware of any local agencies that possess a taser shockwave, but the taser shockwave is expressly identified in AB 481 as one of the types of equipment that's regulated.
Thank you again.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? Yeah, Pam.
Regarding the foam versus the rubber,
Yes.
have you talked with other, police department? Are there any lessons learned or comparable studies, so you don't have to, we don't have to reinvent the wheel?
Yes, so great question. So we.
I could not hear the question.
So, yeah, sure. And for those at home that may not have heard it too, the question was, we referred earlier to the use of a SAGE weapon, which fires less lethal or non-lethal projectiles. The current round that we use is composed of rubber, which is intended to be a distraction device that's not lethal, or at least intended not to be lethal if used properly. We are considering moving to a newer round that's offered, that's made out of a composite foam material. The manufacturer markets it as having the potential to be less injurious than the rubber. But we've committed to testing it to see if it meets our needs. So the question from the audience was, have we or will we compare notes or check with other local agencies to see if they've already done that kind of analysis? Yes, we will absolutely do that, and we routinely do that when we're vetting pieces of equipment, whether it's a weapon or anything else. We routinely talk to our counterparts about law enforcement related software, other types of equipment, to see what their experiences are before we invest in something. So I will make sure that our analysis includes talking to area agencies. There are a few that have already transitioned, as I understand it, to the foam. But because I think this is an important enough thing, I wouldn't feel comfortable unless our range staff actually got their hands on it and tested it on a range to make sure that it meets our expectations. But yes, that'll be certainly part of the analysis. Sure, you're welcome. Any other questions or comments?
Yeah. Just for point of clarity, you guys I should say, you describe it as a distraction weapon. In reality, it's an impact weapon that creates that potentially harm people. So and that's what I want to make sure we all understand that. I mean, that's your understanding as well.
Yeah, so functionally, the way that it works is whether it's a rubber round or whether it's a foam round, it's fired as a projectile, it hits the person. We're aiming for specific areas, avoiding neck, face, groin, etc. The idea, of course, is that the impact of the round is going to either distract the person long enough for us to intervene and get our hands on them, or cause them to say, okay, that they mean business, I'm going to drop my weapon, etc. Part of that obviously is for anyone that's been hit by a paintball round, for example, a paintball round hurts, depending upon where you get hit or what type of clothing you're wearing. Generally, it doesn't break the skin, certainly doesn't break any bones, doesn't cause any permanent damage. But yes, if you're hit with, whether it's a foam round, whether it's a rubber round, or whether we went to a foam round, even if the foam round is softer than the rubber, I would expect that it would be discomfort, it would cause discomfort.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions or comments from the room? All right, hearing none, we will wrap up the meeting for tonight. I appreciate those who attended. I appreciate those who watched live, and I appreciate anyone who takes the time to watch it and it's recorded form later. For those interested in more, webpage or plan to attend the city council meeting on November 13th. So we will end the recording and adjourn.